Mastering your songs for streaming platforms is arguably the biggest mistake you could be making for your music. In today's day and age, everybody and their mama listens to music on streaming platforms such as Spotify, YouTube, Apple Music, Tidal, and many others. So surely we have to listen to what these platforms say and submit our music to the loudness levels of their requests in order for our songs to sound good, right? Well, that's wrong, and I'll tell you why. A lot of people, especially beginner artists, producers, and engineers, are under the impression that when it comes to the loudness levels of their music, a good target to hit is negative 14 dB LUFS in order for their music to sound good. As for where that target came from, we'll get back to that in a second. But for those who may not know, LUFS is a measurement scale used to measure how loud a piece of audio sounds to the human ear. This is important to understand because if you know how the LUFS meter picks up and reacts to sound, then you can use that to your advantage when mixing your music. Since the LUFS meter mimics the human ear sensitivity to specific frequencies, it is most sensitive to frequencies around 2000 kilohertz to 4000 kilohertz. Keep in mind, if your song has a lot of mid-range content around these frequency areas, then naturally your song is going to be perceived louder and read higher on your LUFS meter than if you were to have a super bass heavy track with less sounds occupying this frequency area. So building off of that last point, I wanted to hop into Pro Tools just to show you guys a little quick example. So in Pro Tools, we have the ability to turn on a signal generator. So this is the signal generator that I have right here. Right now we have a sine wave, but for this example, I'm just going to use a square wave. And as you can see here on the right, we have our LUFS meter. So right now we're down at 20 hertz and we're reading negative 17 LUFS at minus 8.6 dB, but I'm just going to drive that all the way up. And if I drive it all the way up, you could see that we have negative 8 dB LUFS. But if I move the frequency knob up higher, look at what happens to the LUFS meter once they get closer to that 2000 to 4000 kilohertz range. So as you can see, it's driving up. So now we're at 0, but watch what happens when we get to 2000. As you can see, we're going higher. It's going up to 1 to 2. Let's move it up to 3. Okay, so if at 3000 we have 3 LUFS, 4000, we're going down a little bit on this little short-term meter thing. And then the higher we go up, as you guys can see right here, this little number, it starts dropping down. So that just goes to show you how the LUFS meter really picks up signal. And just for a cool little fun party trick that I like to do is I like to set this at, let's just say like 1000 for this one. And then if I leave them all at square waves, and then if I turn on all these other signal generators, look at how high it reads. It's going all the way up to 8.3 LUFS, you know? So that's already pretty high. And just so you guys can get a little glimpse of what it sounds like, this is what it sounds like. I'm just gonna turn the volume up a little bit. That's a pretty jarring tone, but that just goes to show you that if you do have a mix that's very dense within that 2000 to 4000 kilohertz frequency area, you're going to get a higher reading on your LUFS meter for your song. Now, why am I telling you this? Because when it comes to mixing and mastering your music to specific targeted LUFS levels, there's no direct answer or need to worry about that, since that is entirely based on the sounds that you're using in your song, which obviously varies from a song to song basis, and it's something that we're going to break down a little bit later in the video. But for example, this is why rock songs generally have higher LUFS readings than something like bass heavy hip hop, because there are a lot of guitars in the mix that are occupying those 2000 to 4000 kilohertz frequency areas, again driving up the reading on the LUFS meter. Now back to where this negative 14 dB LUFS target came from and why it's irrelevant. Although this recommendation can't be tracked down to one specific source, there are 3 main variables that influence and misled the decisions of many to submit their music to this level. The first variable, and probably the most overlooked, comes from broadcasting standards that were adopted in Europe around 2010. These standards were implemented mainly for speech-based content for TV and radio stations to make sure that audio levels are consistent during various parts of a movie or podcast. Now, these are obviously way quieter than the negative 14 dB LUFS recommendation that we see nowadays for music, but Europe was the first to implement an LUFS requirement like this across their broadcasting stations, and so the start of a target loudness was born. Now in America, there's no specific set LUFS requirements for broadcasting. However, the FCC implemented something called the COMM Act that prevents advertisers from having commercials sound louder than whatever it is that you're watching on TV. The target loudness and rules obviously vary based on whatever country you're in, but the name of the game here is consistency. This is why LUFS were invented and why they are used, to provide a more consistent and enjoyable listening experience. Now you may be saying to yourself,
why does this matter? Speech broadcasting for TV and radio doesn't have anything to do with streaming platforms.
Which is where you're wrong. Because now that we know how LUFS is used to keep track of audio levels to make a more consistent and enjoyable listening experience, comes in the main reason why all beginner artists, producers, and engineers think that negative 14 dB LUFS is the standard requirement for the loudness levels of their songs. Streaming platforms. Much like the broadcasting standards, many online streaming platforms have their own target loudness recommendations to turn down louder music and avoid blasting listeners with unexpected changes in loudness. The two most popular streaming platforms would have to be Spotify and Apple Music, and if you go online and search up the target loudness for whichever platform you want to optimize for, like every other beginner does, you will see that Spotify recommends negative 14 dB LUFS and Apple Music recommends negative 16 dB LUFS. But if you look at the other streaming platforms requirements, usually you'll see a negative 14 dB LUFS average across the board, which is exactly why the first thought for a beginner to say is,
if all the platforms say to submit my music to negative 14 dB LUFS, then I should submit my music to that loudness requirement in order to be safe.
Again, another reason why this LUFS target is always so talked about and popularized. But keep in mind, these platforms have these recommendations in place for the sole purpose of creating a more consistent listening experience for the user, which is why default when you download these platforms, they all have the audio normalization turned on to keep the loudness levels consistent from song to song, all in hopes to make the difference in volume less noticeable to the average listener, which isn't always the case. So beware. Just because your song is submitted at an integrated negative 14 dB LUFS does not mean that you're going to get a great sounding, high quality competitive mix. Because what most beginners fail to understand is that Spotify will throw a limiter on your song if it is quieter than negative 14 dB LUFS or if it is quieter than negative 11 dB LUFS and the user has audio normalization turned on with the volume level set to loud. This is a setting on Spotify for those who want their songs to be normalized but still played back louder than negative 14 dB LUFS all the way up to negative 11 dB LUFS, which is already stupid because that contradicts the negative 14 dB LUFS requirement that most people swear by. And if that means that Spotify has to throw a limiter on your song, processing your song without how you intended for it to be processed in order to reach that new negative 11 dB target loudness for this loud setting, completely defeats the purpose of submitting your music to negative 14 dB LUFS in the first place. And just a side note on this limiting, I think Spotify may be the only streaming platform that applies a limiter under these specific situations, but I'm sure I read somewhere online that Apple Music and Tidal don't apply any limiting like this at all. But then again, there's way too many streaming platforms out there to keep track of how they all process audio individually. And keep in mind, all these streaming platforms have the ability to change all of these targets to update and add features surrounding loudness whenever they want, which is why it doesn't even make sense to acknowledge the negative 14 dB LUFS loudness recommendation, because it could potentially be a moving target that you could not hit. The last thing I want to get into before I answer the most commonly asked question, so how loud should we submit our music, is the last reason why negative 14 dB LUFS or being around that loudness range has become so heavily popularized. Common industry practice from other artists, producers, or engineers. We live in a day and age where everyone has access to the internet, and although there's some good information out there, drop a like if you like this video, there's even more inaccurate information from underqualified people that you have to constantly be sorting through. For example, on one side you have artists or other people who have been engineering or producing music for less than a year trying to give you tips on how loud you should submit your music because they made one little Google search and decided to share their groundbreaking discovery with the world. And on the other side, you have the snobby audiophile engineers who swear that their shit don't stink, saying that the only way for your song to sound good is if you retain dynamics as much as possible and keep your songs closer to the target loudness so you could avoid distortion from pushing your songs too hard, which naturally results in a lower LUFS reading. So addressing the first crowd of people that I like to call the unexperienced, uneducated, or new booties, no offense if this is you, is that often the information they gain is just surface level. Like they say, birds of a feather flock together. So since there's always new people coming into the music community every single year, typically what happens is other beginners will see this surface level information circulating online, like submitting your music to negative 14 dB LUFS, and share it with their friends, so this misinformation spreads like wildfire. And on the other hand, the audio snobs who have been engineering for longer just swear that their songs sound better with more dynamics because they're too scared of these big and bad platforms causing unwanted distortions to their mix, and do not know how to successfully mix their songs to sound loud and dynamic. Which is funny because if you look at these engineers, they preach dynamics but continue to use compressors, saturators, clippers to tame these dynamics. so how much dynamics do you really need? Why choose one or the other when you could have both? Which brings me to my next and final point, which I'm sure all of you are wondering. How loud should we submit our music? So the main reason why I went into the history of all these things and how everything works is just so that you, the viewer, are properly educated and aren't scared to push the limits of your music, which a lot of professional audio engineers already understand. So if we take a look at the top charts, you will see that a lot of the mixes from big commercial artists are being submitted much higher than the negative 14 dB LUFS recommendation. And if you notice from these examples, there is no one set specific target that each song is hitting every single time. Like how I explained earlier in the video, the way that an LUFS meter works is it mimics how we as humans perceive sound. So it is more sensitive to that 2000 to 4000 kilohertz region. This is why I want to mention that mixing to a specific target loudness should not be your main goal, because depending on the genre and frequency content that's within your song, the results will always vary. The first thing you should do is just get the song to sound good itself, and then apply specific techniques like clipping, saturation, compression, and all that other good stuff that will increase the perceived loudness of your mix, which in result will make it sound more competitive. But I must note it gets much deeper than that. And although having a high LUFS should not be your primary goal, if you play back your song next to a professionally engineered record and that reference song has a higher LUFS reading, still feels dynamic, and isn't distorting as much as you think it would, then it is going to outshine your mix every single time. Because even with the loudness normalization turned on from these platforms, there have still been many reports that songs submitted at negative 14 dB LUFS sound way quieter than other songs when compared in playlists. And that's just how it is. If regular people outside of the music community perceive louder as better, why not make the effort into learning how to make our music sound good at really loud levels? Because it is one thing to get a high LUFS reading, but another thing to sound good there. And this is why audio engineers are very important, because the ones who already know all this information are always looking for a way to push the bar forward when it comes to their music. And they spend countless hours making sure that their music competes at a competitive loudness level and still sounds great. As for me personally, if I have access to the full trackouts when mixing a song, I could usually get my mixes to hit anywhere around negative 6 dB LUFS down to negative 9 dB LUFS. But personally, I wouldn't go any quieter than that. And I mainly work with a lot of bass heavy trap, rap, and pop records. So depending on whatever genre you're working in, again, those results may vary. Another thing to consider here is that your music isn't only going to be played on these specific streaming platforms, which is why you shouldn't only master for the target requirements of these platforms. If you ever plan on doing live shows to perform your music in festivals, stadiums, or other places similar, these systems do not have a negative whatever dB LUFS requirement and just play your songs as is, which is why if you can get your music to sound good and as loud as it can be, then you'll be good. But don't just take my word for it. Here's what 16-time Grammy Award winning engineer Jason Joshua has to say about loudness and LUFS.
Now, a lot of people talk about the loudness wars and Spotify and Apple Music lowering the music, but what you have to understand is when you have a record like this with this amount of harmonics, this amount of parallel compression, and -7 LUFS, it's all about being -7 LUFS and perceive that loud, but yet you still have the dynamics and the openness. So you're not squashed. You're not getting hurt by taking yours -7 all the way down to -18, because you still have the perceived perception of it being loud and having the dynamics and the openness. A lot of records that are at -7, -6, or -5 seem crushed, seem thin. They seem to have no dynamics, but they're not worried about the early reflections. They're not worried about tremolo. They're not worried about depth. They're not worried about space. So when we listen to these records by some of the top guys that are extremely loud, they still have the dynamics, they still have the openness, and they still feel like a -14 or -16 LUFS record. And that's the key. I always equate it to like driving a Mercedes and you get pulled over by a cop. The cop asks you how fast you were going. You say about 60. He tells you, no, you were going 120. That's the same thing when it comes to these LUFS. You want to be -7, -6, up there with the big dogs, but you also want to be open. You want to have clarity. You want to have depth. You want to have all your transients. And you definitely want to work on your early reflections so you can keep that depth between each individual instrument and change it periodically.
And if you guys want to know specific step-by-step techniques on how to mix loud, then you're just going to have to subscribe and stay tuned for the next video. But if you're an artist or producer that wants to get your song professionally mixed and hear how far you could push the limits of your sound, then you could click the link down below and fill out the form so I could help you make your next hit. But if you guys want to learn more about audio engineering yourself, then click here so you could learn how to mix vocals the proper way. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.